I know. What do you want to see? Just wait and see. Do you remember when we fell in love? We were young and innocent then. Do you remember how it all began? It just seemed like heaven, so I did it. And do you remember back in the fall, we'd be together all day long? Do you remember us holding hands and each other as we'd stare? Tell me, do you remember the time when we fell in love? Do you remember when we first met, girl? Do you remember the time when we fell in love? Do you remember the time when we first met, girl? Do you remember the time when we fell in love? Do you remember the time? Do you remember how we used to talk? You know, we'd stay on the phone at night till dawn. Do you remember all the things we said, like I love you so I'll never let you go? Do you remember back in spring, every morning birds would sing? Do you remember those special times? They'll just go on in the back of my mind. Do you remember the time when we fell in love? Do you remember the time when we first met, girl? Remember the time when we fell in love? Do you remember the time? The sweet memories will always be dear to me. And girl, no matter what was said, I will never forget what we had. Now, baby, remember the time? Do you remember when we fell in love? Do you remember the time when we first met? Girl, remember the time when we fell in love? Do you remember the time? Remember, my baby, remember the time? 'Cause I remember when we fell in love. Do you remember the time? All in my mind, girl. Do you remember the time? Remember, my baby, remember the time? Oh! Remember the time? Do you remember, girl? Remember the time on the phone, you and me, till dawn, 2 or 3. What about us, girl? Remember the time? Do you? Do you? Do you? Do you remember the time in the park, on the beach, you and me in Spain? What about? What about? Remember the time in the park? Remember the time after dark? Do you? Do you? Do you? Remember the time? Do you? Do you? Do you? Do you? Remember the time? Remember the time?